All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Kellen Warner, and I am the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as a Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California State Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you're interested in joining or in watching past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found in the follow-up email you'll receive after today's webinar. So to go into some logistics about the webinar itself, we will first listen and watch the presentation for about 45-50 minutes, and there'll be a follow-up Q&A session. During the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A on the box in the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom screen, which we've all become so familiar with over the last couple of years. This webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. So in today's presentation, BCDC and collaborating partners will provide an overview of what the Adaptation Roadmap is, how to use this dynamic resource in your own communities, and examples of key concepts in adaptation applied in practice. We are joined today by a fantastic group of panelists, and in the interest of time, I will pass it over to our first one, Jacqueline Mendosky, a coastal scientist in the Adapting to Rising Tides program at BCDC. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Kellen. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Get myself set up. Okay. Hello, good morning and welcome. Thank you again, Kellen, the State Coastal Conservancy and the California Resilience Network for organizing this event. As Kellen said, my name is Jacqueline Mendosky and I'm a coastal scientist at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC. And I'm joined by my three fellow colleagues who I will introduce in the next slide. So today we're doing a special webinar training to share a new resource produced by BCDC in collaboration with supporting partners. For those who don't know us, BCDC is a state agency that works regionally in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have both planning and regulatory functions, and within our planning division, we have a program called Adapting to Rising Tides, or ART, which specializes in providing resources and working in partnerships with local jurisdictions and communities on sea level rise adaptation planning. So this new resource we are excited to share with you today is called the Adaptation Roadmap, a practitioner's guide to plan and implement a collaborative, equitable, integrative, and flexible approach to sea level rise adaptation. This work was guided by an advisory committee of 12 adaptation planners and practitioners in the Bay Area, including my three co-presenters, and involved over 3 dozen individuals who contributed to the development in various ways. So as Kellen mentioned, today we're going to provide an overview of what the Adaptation Roadmap is, how to use it in your communities, and what these concepts look like in practice. We'll be sharing a lot of examples from the San Francisco Bay Area, but I want to emphasize that this resource can be applied anywhere. The intention of the roadmap is to help diverse stakeholders visualize and understand the many components of a robust adaptation process and use this resource to work towards a shared outcomes. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat with access to the slides that you'll be seeing here today so that you have all these resources in front of you. So we've structured this webinar as a training. So first I'll provide an introduction to the Adaptation Roadmap, and then we'll go through each chapter individually. I will serve as your navigator on this Adaptation Roadmap journey. For each chapter, I'll provide an overview, followed by one of my colleagues who will share an example of relevant local adaptation planning work that highlights these key concepts in practice. So I'm joined today by Chris Chu, Planning Manager for Marin County's Department of Public Works, Jeremy Lowe, Senior Scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Claire Bonham-Carter, Director of Sustainable Development at AECOM. As you may have read from their bios, these are all fantastic experts in the adaptation field, and I know I'm extremely excited for them to share their experiences to drive home the concepts in the Adaptation Roadmap. So without further ado, let's dive in. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, there has been a lot of momentum over the last decade on understanding local and regional vulnerabilities to sea level rise. These studies are essential to recognizing important issues and risks facing different communities. Ultimately, based on the information from these vulnerability assessments, we, and the collective we, want to see local jurisdictions and communities develop collaborative and equitable outcomes that are locally driven and regionally aligned. However, there is a key set of steps and conversations that need to happen in between these two things, because to get to the outcomes that we want, we need to involve people. And in that space, the challenges of solving sea level rise adaptation raise significant and often messy topics. These include what people value, the health of the environment, and root causes of inequities. It includes people's histories, politics, engineering, and decision-making. Adaptation raises these non-traditional timelines and intergenerational challenges that we have to grapple with and discuss. Ultimately, identifying adaptation solutions is more than just a technical challenge, it's also a societal decision and requires a societal response. So it is all of these complicated pieces that we need to navigate and work through in order to get to better outcomes that, in addition to providing flood protection, also improve people's quality of life, the health of our habitats and ecosystems, and our ability to respond to changing conditions. The Adaptation Roadmap is designed to address this need. It is designed to pick up after a vulnerability assessment and provide a 6-chapter organizational framework for practitioners to move beyond vulnerability to collaboratively build equitable outcomes that respond to change over time. It also includes 6 corresponding workbooks to help keep track of the work you're doing and make it easier to share progress and build upon your effort as you go. So it's really designed to help groups of people navigate these complex pieces to reach effective outcomes. So let's talk more specifically about who this resource is for. The Adaptation Roadmap is designed for practitioners, and it was developed by practitioners. And when I use the word practitioners, I mean local government staff, community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, tribal governments, special districts, consultants, and more. So this graphic comes from the Adaptation Roadmap in Chapter 2.1, Managing the Adaptation Process, and illustrates how individuals and representatives from 3 key areas of local government, communities, and tribes, and locally relevant groups and organizations should all come together to collectively drive adaptation. Therefore, practitioners should be diverse, and we should build up the capacity of more sectors and organizations to be part of the process and feel empowered to be part of the solutions. So now let's get a bit into what's in the Adaptation Roadmap. There's an introduction that provides some important context about the landscape of sea level rise adaptation. It highlights key challenges, ways to consider framing challenges as opportunities, and sets expectations for those engaging in an adaptation effort. It also embeds 4 foundational pillars, which I'll go into more detail in the next slide. And lastly, it provides a space to easily navigate across the entire adaptation roadmap so you can quickly access the topics and resources you need. So in this training, we'll be going through each chapter one by one, but I first want to provide you a big picture overview so you can see the process that we'll be taking you through. As you'll see, each chapter is organized around a key theme, but the chapters also build on one another. So these include Chapter 1, Build Your Adaptation Roadmap. This is the starting point. It's the place to pick up the pieces of existing work and consider what your adaptation effort is trying to achieve. Chapter 2 is Center People and Decision Making. This is the place to organize the process and determine how people will participate through all of the remaining chapters. The entire process is about bringing diverse stakeholders and communities into key conversations to find opportunities for shared solutions. Chapter 3 is Set Local Context and Sense of Place. This is about gathering key pieces of local information to understand local conditions and opportunities. This sets the foundation for the issues and defines the problems that adaptation is trying to solve. Chapter 4 is Shape a Shared Vision of the Future. This is about using your local context to look ahead and explore and brainstorm the kind of future you want to achieve. This is our opportunity to think broadly and creatively about how we might want to solve the issues in front of us. Chapter 5 is Bring Together Shared Solutions. This is where specific actions and strategies are identified to meet the vision in Chapter 4. This also includes considering the phasing and timing of adaptation actions to embed the element of time. And lastly, Chapter 6 is Pathways Approach to Implementation, which is about organizing your approach for taking early actions, as well as how you will set yourself up to be responsive to the ever-changing conditions that we will face in our new era of climate change. So this is the Adaptation Roadmap at a glance. This graphic here is squiggly for a reason. Adaptation is complicated, and when you're involving a lot of people and discussing difficult topics, it's going to be messy. Probably going to have to go backwards at times in order to move forward, but that's okay. That's part of the process that we need to go through to reach these important societal choices that we have to make. So I mentioned in the last slide that there are 4 foundational pillars embedded across the entire document. These pillars represent core ideas and values that we believe are essential for robust adaptation. The first is the need for collaborative multi-sector adaptation. For those of us working in the field, we know there is no single entity who can solve the complex challenges of sea level rise alone. Throughout the document, there is an emphasis on how, by engaging in a collaborative, multi-sector and multi-jurisdictional process early, adaptation can be set up to define shared issues more easily and more easily identify multi-benefit solutions. Alongside collaboration is the need for equitable community-driven planning. As I will keep saying, creating a more equitable future underpins all of adaptation planning efforts. This resource elevates best practices of building an equitable process to ensure the outcomes and solutions truly benefit those most vulnerable and most impacted by climate change. This graphic comes from the roadmap and illustrates what an inequitable process looks like, as well as one that has equity built in. The document strives to add the level of detail that practitioners need as we move into adaptation planning. The third pillar is being integrative about plans, processes, and people. We all know that we don't have the resources to keep adding more plans and more processes to our plates. So instead, this resource emphasizes and encourages ways to adjust and transform our existing processes and systems to set ourselves up to be more capable of responding to change. And lastly, this resource elevates the need to have a flexible approach for making decisions over time. So this refers to using an adaptation pathways approach, where decisions are made in discrete increments of time. This also elevates the need to create a flexible process and adjust your approach as you go. So there's a lot of content in the adaptation roadmap, but it is designed to be used flexibly, either by reading parts of sections or following the process in full. It can be a reference to learn from and come back to when you're ready to use the concepts in practice. I've also mentioned that it's a fully linkable document that strives to be easy to navigate. There's a lot of visuals and graphics as well to help illustrate key points. One of the big pieces that we unfortunately won't have time to dive into today is that each of the chapters have a corresponding and downloadable PDF workbook that provides space for people to record their progress as they go. These workbooks can also be a place to start as they reference where in the roadmap more details can be found. And perhaps most importantly, this resource acknowledges that everyone comes into adaptation with different starting points, and there is no single outcome of adaptation. There are many, from community capacity building to meeting plan mandates, building projects, and more. This resource was created to provide a foundational framework that allows you to use it in the ways you need it and guide your journey to solutions. So with that, let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into each chapter. So welcome to chapter 1, Build Your Adaptation Roadmap. As I mentioned, the Adaptation Roadmap is designed to build upon existing sea level rise studies and move the needle in ways that make sense for your jurisdiction and communities. This chapter is the likely starting point for anyone who's interested in organizing themselves around a sea level rise effort. Even if you're unsure of what outcomes you want, this is the place to start. Chapter 1 is largely a self-assessment to help you figure out your starting point and how to use the resources within to reach your desired outcomes. It is best suited for anyone who is interested in initiating the effort, which could be governments, non-governmental organizations or NGOs, community-based organizations or CBOs, special districts, and more. In the next chapter 2, we'll dive deeper into who organizes and leads the effort, but in this chapter, anyone interested in helping get adaptation efforts off the ground can find value in this resource. The 3 main parts of this chapter include section 1.1, which is about assessing why you're here, what outcomes you want to achieve, and what's the key motivation, opportunities, and barriers that you see. Section 1.2 is assessing your issues and scale. This includes reviewing past studies, connected issues, and the state of sea level rise and flooding science. This is also the place to start thinking about scale, which is likely connected to your foundational studies and issues. And section 1.3 is assessing your capacity and resources. What is the readiness of government, communities, and other stakeholders? What resources, including funding, are available now, and what resources and funding may be needed to get this effort going? The chapter 1 workbook is about helping you navigate the adaptation roadmap. So based on your responses to the question posed across the chapter, the workbook offers a list of strengths and opportunities, as well as challenges to address that can be shared with others as you're moving into your adaptation process. This chapter workbook also includes a checklist for you to complete that results in a list of sections to review to help get you to your desired outcomes. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Chris Chu, who will share some examples of using this in Marin County.
Great, thank you. So there are numerous different approaches or on-ramps to adaptation, and the need comes from a lot of different starting points, as Jackie mentioned. So I just wanted to start by saying many of us have done this through trial and error, but the adaptation roadmap really presents a more thoughtful approach. And so I really encourage folks to take a look at those workbooks, even if you're just casually walking through them and referring back to each chapter so that you get what you want at the end of your process. It's great as you start to just document your process and capture all the pieces as you go. So a few of the issues driving adaptation planning in Marin. The first photo just shows flooding, historic flooding at the north end of Sausalito near Marin City. Sorry, it's got lost in my thoughts here. Past and future flood risk really provides motivation as well as often some barriers. And this helps for us planning with FEMA flood levels, but sea level rise on top of FEMA can be really challenging on the existing landscape. So some of the what and why can be existing flooding. We also have a fairly comprehensive awareness of sea level rise risks based on our vulnerability assessment, which is that second photo. So as Jackie mentioned, this is really, once you have that done, we know where our risks are, and we need to know how to move forward with adaptation. The next piece of this really gets at that opportunity. And so we have a photo in that the third photo is of Novato Creek, of Deer Island. And sometimes our projects come to us because of funding opportunities and our political pressures. So I'm looking for projects that fit those grants as they come out and provide money to do the work. And then lastly, community-driven requests for help really drive how we might actually get started with adaptation in a given location. So we have limited resources at the county, and so we're looking at capacity both within the community, who's coming to us, who are the stakeholders, and then also on our team to lead and plan that work. Next slide.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome to Chapter 2, Center People in Decision Making. Having equitable outcomes for adaptation that are supported by the people who live there requires embedding meaningful participation into the process from the very beginning. Chapter 2 is about organizing your adaptation effort, including determining the decision-making processes and structures for communities and stakeholders to participate. That is both collaborative and equitable. It is best suited for those managing the process. Those interested in driving an adaptation effort should review Section 2.1, Managing the Process, which will help you determine your core team, early engagement with key partners, such as community-based organizations, and thinking through the role of consultants. The core team and key partners can then review the following 3 sections. This includes 2.2, Input in the Process, which is about understanding who should be involved to participate and why. One of the main points here is identifying local champions from key stakeholder groups to help co-develop these participation and outreach approaches. Section 2.3 is Participation and Decisions, which provides ideas for what participation can look like and thinking through the decision-making process to find opportunities for communities to have greater influence in shaping what the adaptation process and outcomes will look like. And lastly, Section 2.4 is Effective Communications, which provides best practices for ensuring you are communicating to your communities and stakeholders in ways that resonate with them and improve how people engage in this effort. The outcomes of Workbook 2 include having a management team and co-created participation strategies that include the decision-making process. I'll now turn it over to Claire to provide some examples and use of this chapter's content in San Mateo County.
Jackie. The case study I'm going to highlight is the Caltrans-funded Dumbarton Bridge Resilience Study, which was completed in 2020. And I'm going to focus on the community engagement components, but if you want to learn more, particularly about the adaptation strategies, the final report is available online at the address on this slide. So this project focused on the Dumbarton Bridge, which spans the San Francisco Bay, connecting Alameda County to San Mateo, carrying 70,000 vehicles or so a day in pre-COVID times. The cities of Menlo Park and East Palo Alto are right next to it, where low-income and socially vulnerable communities live and work. There are salt ponds being actively restored either side of the bridge touchdown, with special nesting sites for the snowy plover, as well as unique tidal wetlands. There's also important utility infrastructure here, including a large PG&E substation and an SFPUC water pipeline. And this entire area is very vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge and is already experiencing high tide flooding. So this site is clearly very complex, the assets are very interconnected, and an integrated adaptation strategy could protect multiple assets. So it was super important to bring partners to the table. The project management group was led by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and included state agencies, the local cities, and they helped to steer the project and provided detailed feedback on methods and deliverables. We also had a large stakeholder advisory group that included environmental NGOs, open space and business districts, county government, transportation agencies, and several of them were already doing sea level rise related studies themselves. And so again, super important to coordinate with these efforts, in particular with relation to community engagement. Stakeholder group included 2 community-based organizations, Actera and Nuestra Casa, that were already active in the community carrying out climate change-related activities. Next. The Nuestra Casa is a community-based organization with a long-standing presence in the East Palo Alto community, and they had already been piloting an environmental justice academy. And we really wanted to focus on helping the community understand the flood risk they faced and how projects like this could help protect their homes and provide additional benefits, say, such as shoreline access. We did not want residents to have to come out for project-specific meetings for a topic that they may not know or care about when they have more urgent daily needs to attend to. So MTC commissioned Nuestra Casa to develop a 3-lesson parent academy covering water quality and sea level rise that took place over a 3-week period with dinner and a stipend provided for each participant. AECOM and BCDC supported on the development of the climate change lessons and a focus session on the Dumbarton Bridge project that came at the end. The participants were divided into cultural cohorts, including Pacific Islander, Spanish-speaking, African-American, and youth, with Nuestra Casa facilitators to help make participants feel as comfortable as possible. Consulting staff were on hand to answer questions, and given the long-term risk faced, there was just a real need to build solid understanding in the community of what's happening so they can meaningfully participate in conversations which are inevitably going to continue for years. Next. This slide illustrates the feedback we got from the community on what was important to them, which was then incorporated into the project alternatives and final report. Their concern for environmental stewardship was really clear, as well as their understanding of the need for potentially extensive infrastructure to protect their homes. And what I found super impressive was the level of engagement, questions, and feedback compared to a more typical workshop scenario. And for the purposes of this section today and the guidance today, the content of the feedback isn't important, but what is this type of participatory engagement structure and the partnerships and trust that were necessary for this to happen. And what was really effective was having the content framed and delivered by facilitators that were known in the community, and that time was spent capacity building before feedback was asked for. Next.
Great, thank you, Claire. All right, welcome to chapter 3, setting your local context and sense of place. So this chapter is about using the participation approaches identified in chapter 2 to engage in conversations and dialogue with communities and stakeholders to discuss the local conditions of where they live. Chapter 3 is about gathering, reviewing, and discussing local conditions to set the context for the problems and inform the path to solutions. In this chapter, the core team and key partners will work with communities and stakeholders to go through the content of this section and engage in meaningful dialogue. This chapter includes section 3.1, aligning local and regional plans. This includes evaluating the results of a vulnerability assessment, considering what plans can or should be aligned, and identifying what your neighboring jurisdictions are doing to ensure that you're coordinating effectively. Section 3.2 is centering community values, starting with where communities are and what they care about, as well as connecting to local forms of knowledge and spending time discussing the history and stories of place. Section 3.3 is about understanding the environmental and physical conditions of the landscape, including the value of nature to our lives, identifying local projects and infrastructure, and thinking about shoreline planning units. The last section in 3.4 introduces adaptation pathways and the approach to making decisions in discrete periods of time. A key part of this section is creating local planning horizons to define the short, medium, and long-term future, which are then used to explore future scenarios in the next chapter 4. The outcomes in workbook 3 include a list of plans and processes, stories of place, nature-based conditions, shoreline planning units, and time horizons. So I'll now turn it over to Jeremy to provide some examples and use of this chapter's content in the city of Nevada.
Thank you, Jackie. So I'm going to take a closer look at the local context and place. The San Francisco Bay is large and the shoreline is varied, from the low-lying agricultural fields and marshes in the North Bay to the urban waterfronts, ports and seawalls of the Central Bay, to the vast salt ponds and low-lying urbanized areas of the South Bay. And the communities within these cities likewise vary widely in their needs and aspirations. Adaptation is driven not only by the needs of the communities and the built environment, but also has to take account of the natural processes that shape the bay. It's important that we maintain the ecosystem services or beneficial uses that these natural processes provide, such as supporting wildlife, ameliorating flooding, help maintaining water quality, and providing recreation. Many of these natural processes occur on a scale larger than individual city jurisdictions. A project in one city may affect how water flows on a larger scale, which impacts flooding in another city. So when planning along the shoreline, we need to look outside traditional city jurisdictions and at larger scale that considers natural processes and aligns with neighboring efforts. SFEI, with funding from the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board, and there's a shout out to Christina Toms, I know is on the call today, has developed an adaptation atlas that uses an understanding of physical processes to classify the bay shoreline into 30 cross-jurisdictional operational landscape units, or nature's jurisdictions. Each OLU has shared geographic, geophysical, and ecological characteristics that make it an effective unit for planning for sea level rise. The atlas also describes the environmental setting for each OLU, including elements of the built landscape, such as zoning and housing density and job density that influence land use planning. Next slide, please. The atlas goes on to describe and map the types of adaptation measures that would be appropriate to that part of the bay. These measures range from traditional engineered structures such as levees and seawalls to nature-based measures such as nearshore oyster reefs, tidal marshes, and beaches. In reality, many of the solutions will be hybrids of both traditional and nature-based measures, as the different elements play different roles and address different problems. For instance, marshes and beaches may help reduce wave action, but only levees and seawalls will prevent high water levels from flooding an area. However, project designs that incorporate natural features in the long term on a landscape scale are more likely to support beneficial uses now and in the future. Next slide, please. The atlas then pairs each operational landscape unit with a suite of potentially feasible adaptation measures, as shown in this example of Novato in the North Bay. These show where the nature-based measures, such as the restoration of marshes in the blue areas, that could be combined with more traditional measures, such as levees and tide gates. The atlas also describes considerations for each nature-based approach, including its potential environmental impacts and benefits, and its adaptability to increasing amounts of sea level rise over time. Not every measure is feasible in every location. Features such as marshes need space, and if space is limited, levees and seawalls with steeper slopes may be the appropriate option. Nature-based measures also need consideration of processes. For example, marshes and beaches rely on the movement and deposition of sand and mud to respond to sea level rise, so maintaining the sediment supply is crucial. Next slide, please. As well as location, timing is an important factor in adaptation planning. Ideally, appropriate measures are in place in anticipation of rising sea levels, and this will be discussed by Claire later in the webinar. But here, it is important to note that natural and nature-based features have their own timing, largely driven by ecological processes. This slide shows the Nevada OLU and how starting marsh restoration at two different times will have significant impacts at the end of the century. In these maps, blue is water, brown is mudflat, and green is marsh. Starting from today on the left, the top row shows restoration starting in 2030 and snapshots of the habitats in 2050, 2070, and 2100, resulting in a significant amount of marsh. The lower row shows the difference in delaying restoration until 2050, resulting in a lot less marsh and a lot more mudflat. Location and timing are both important considerations in adaptation planning. And now I'm going to turn this back to Jackie.
Thank you, Jeremy. All right, welcome to Chapter 4, Shape a Shared Vision of the Future. This chapter is about looking ahead at the different ways we might be able to solve the problems raised in Chapter 3. It is designed to provide people the space needed to be thoughtful and reflective. A challenge as big as sea level rise requires that we fully consider how the choices we make today will affect not only our own futures, but also the choices available to future generations. Chapter 4 supports laying out the problem and determining what kind of future communities and stakeholders want, defining what success means, and exploring what it could look like to get there. In this chapter, the core team and key partners will engage with communities and stakeholders to conduct visioning and scenario planning exercises to ensure that people have opportunities to fully shape this chapter's outcomes. This chapter includes section 4.1 on defining the problem. This includes discussing how people feel about risk, understanding the context in which decisions are made, and identifying the key issues to be solved based on everything that's been raised so far. Section 4.2 is about describing what success means. This includes the vision, core guiding principles, and the criteria that will be used to evaluate actions and strategies that will be developed in Chapter 5. Section 4.3 is possibly my favorite, and it's exploring future scenarios. This section introduces what scenario planning is and why it can be so useful in climate change adaptation. It introduces the strategic approaches of protect, accommodate, avoid, and retreat, and then asks communities to explore different kinds of futures to understand the trade-offs and choices of different approaches. This section elevates the importance of thinking about adaptation over time, where planning horizons developed in Chapter 3 come back into play. Lastly, section 4.4 is a space to discuss outcomes and expectations. This is where some difficult conversations may occur, especially when considering longer-term futures, such as managed retreat. It provides an opportunity to consider how we might change the future decision context and what scenarios we want to explore in greater detail in Chapter 5. The outcomes of Workbook 4 include a shared vision and guiding principles and scenarios that align with the vision over the short, medium, and long term. I'll now turn it back over to Jeremy to provide some examples and use of this chapter's content in the East Bay and the San Leandro, Oakland, Alameda Estuary.
Thank you, Jackie. So my case study is an example of shaping a vision by developing future scenarios using work that SFEI has recently undertaken for the San Leandro Bay, Oakland, Alameda Estuary Adaptation Working Group. And there's a big shout out to Danielle Miller of the City of Alameda, who I think is on the call. The working group's planning area is the San Leandro OOU, which extends from the Bay Bridge to Oyster Bay Regional Shoreline. And there are over 25 stakeholders with interests in the San Leandro Bay shoreline, including the cities of Alameda and Oakland, community-based organizations, the Port of Oakland, and East Bay Regional Park District. And there are significant assets vulnerable to sea level rise in this area, including residential communities, the Port of Oakland at Oakland Airport, recreational facilities including the Bay Trail, critical habitats such as Arrowhead Marsh, and transportation corridors, including Interstate 880 and Doolittle Drive. In guiding the future scenarios, we took existing projects together with the overall goals of the group of maintaining transportation corridors, improving access, and improving flood protection, while maintaining existing marshes and increasing those marshes' ability to adapt to rising seas. Next slide, please. In our work for the group, we focused on identifying opportunities for nature-based measures and developing adaptation pathways in the San Leandro Bay, south of Alameda Island and north of Oakland Airport. There are already several planned and ongoing projects in this area, ranging from relocating roads to restoring marshes. And many of these projects have been developed independently, and we aim to bring them into a coherent set of actions with a common timeline. These scenarios would allow the working group to consider how they could leverage and align these different projects and also work collaboratively on funding opportunities. Our process in developing the scenarios was very much in line with the roadmap developed by BCDC. Firstly, identify focus areas and key resources vulnerable to sea level rise, then identify vulnerabilities and opportunities associated with each resource. We then developed adaptation strategies to address vulnerabilities using existing projects where possible, and paired these strategies with key sea level rise elevations when actions would have to be taken. Next slide, please. So here's a close-up of San Leandro Bay. Blue is the bay, lighter blue, the mudflats and shallows, green marshes, and the red lines are key roads. And we considered two scenarios. Our first scenario is to protect in place. In the near term, or phase 1 on the left, that includes raising a road and some habitat enhancements. Then over time, the second phase on the right includes raising the road again as water levels rise and doing additional habitat strategies such as adding sediment to the marshes. In this scenario, the road infrastructure stays in place, and to maintain habitats, we must keep raising them. Next slide, please. Our second scenario is to allow marshes to migrate. This scenario is more focused on the marsh patches and ensures their longevity by providing space for marsh migration. If space is available, marshes can move inland with rising sea levels, and this can help prevent habitat loss. In the near term, or phase 1 on the left, that includes increasing tidal flows under the existing roads to improve marshes behind the existing road and some interim flood management measures. Phase 2 on the right includes the realignment of roads and trails to increase space for marshes to migrate and move the road to a more feasible location to maintain in the long term. These scenarios were developed for the working group to illustrate the linkages between various projects and to serve as a starting point for their discussions on how to work together to create plans for San Leandro OLU. And now I'll turn it back to Jackie.
Thank you, Jeremy. All right, so welcome to Chapter 5, Bring Together Shared Solutions. This chapter is about identifying specific actions and strategies to meet the envisioned futures from Chapter 4. Chapter 5 supports bringing together all of the pieces to build the adaptation strategies that reflect community and stakeholders' concerns and are bundled, phased, evaluated, and selected. In this chapter, the core team and key partners will work with technical experts, advanced planners, and or other consultants to apply specific strategies based on the vision and guiding principles of Chapter 4. This chapter includes Section 5.1, Explore Actions. This introduces the categories of adaptation actions and points to an Excel database called the Art Adaptation Catalog that can be used when considering specific actions. Section 5.2 introduces the idea of bundling strategies. This refers to thinking about not only the physical built solutions, but adding in the necessary pieces of policy, planning, capacity building, and funding needed to make holistic and robust strategies. Section 5.3 is where actions are phased and sequenced. This means considering action lifespans and how long they'll be effective for. It's also the place to consider when a set of actions or strategies might need to change and what decision points may be needed. This is also where Pathways diagram can be useful in communicating these concepts to different audiences. It's important to note as well that both chapters 4 and 5 can occur separately or really at the same time, depending on the level of detail that communities and stakeholders want to achieve in their scenario planning exercises. The final part of this chapter is Section 5.4, in where these refined details are brought back to communities and stakeholders, evaluated against the initial criteria, where trade-offs are discussed and ultimately decisions are made. The outcomes of Workbook 5 include a set of strategies that respond to the adaptation risks over time and are supported by the community. I'll now turn it over to Claire to provide some examples and use of this chapter's content in San Francisco.
Thanks, Jackie. So, Islas Creek is the district in San Francisco between the Southern Dogpatch and Northern Bayview neighborhoods. And if any of you have seen the multi-story grain silo painted with a beautiful mural from the 101, that's Islas Creek. And this project was a Caltrans-funded collaboration between the SFMTA, Planning, Port, and the SFPUC. The area is highly vulnerable to stormwater and high tide flooding already, and is also at significant risk of sea level rise and storm surge in the future. The area is also the subject of a couple different planning efforts, including the Port's Waterfront Resilience Program and an Army Corps flood study. And so collaboration between all of these partners, again, crucial, particularly around coordinated community input and participation. And as part of the project, we developed adaptation strategies within these 5 reaches due to the various flood paths. Next. For the purposes of today, I'm going to zoom in and reach 3. And in this image, you can see the MTA bus facility. And as an earlier part of the project, we had developed a toolkit of different types of strategy appropriate for the different types of shoreline here, from engineered, earthen to natural, alongside and using those and alongside an understanding of the progression of flooding over time. We developed a series of strategies that would protect the bus facility. And I'll also highlight that a good source of strategy ideas is the Art Adaptation Catalog. So the bus facility is vulnerable from stormwater that torrent off the 280 overpass during heavy rain. No, next slide is good, Jackie. And there are other stormwater related issues which compound high tide flooding issues from the creek too. But as well as solving this flooding problem, a key goal was to maintain and improve the creek sidewalk through constructing a living shoreline project along the creek bank and connect the two sides of the creek with a pedestrian bridge to help create this larger vision for the area of a sort of creekside destination. So finally, I wanted to share an example of the adaptation pathways diagram that we created for the reaches, which illustrates the appropriate timing and flood depth of when different decisions need to be made. And an adaptation pathway is made up of a sequence of manageable steps or decision points over time. So rather than making all the decisions now, the approach is designed to schedule decision making. So it identifies the decisions that need to be taken now and those that are better made in the future, depending on how conditions evolve. So on this diagram, flood depths and approximate timeframes are along the top of the diagram and the strategies on the left, with timelines for those strategies being implemented shown on by the various lines, and then the dots showing a strategy being implemented. And then the dots themselves when a strategy is implemented. The dotted lines show the development of the strategies. Triangles are the key decision points which may trigger a different strategy to start. And the different color lines show the different types of physical strategy that we included. So you can see that there are a whole range of strategy types that go into the adaptation pathways for just 2 of the 5 sections that make up the pathways for just reach 3. So it's complex. The lines that start to the far left of the diagram are essentially form the immediate to-do list for the planning department and partners, with different steps triggered as sea levels rise. Back to you, Jackie, for the final chapter.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. All right. Welcome to chapter 6, our final chapter, Pathways Approach to Implementation. So this final chapter is about organizing the next steps to advance actions we can take today, as well as be better prepared for the longer term. Chapter 6 supports advancing adaptation outcomes through the appropriate plans, processes, and people, and developing approaches for implementing next steps and monitoring over time. In this chapter, the core team and key partners will work with local champions to distribute responsibility for implementation across the necessary sectors. This chapter includes section 6.1, linking strategies to outcomes. This is about connecting the adaptation strategies developed to the appropriate plans, people, and existing projects or processes to embed the actions effectively into implementation. Section 6.2 is about laying out next steps for what actions need to be implemented first and how to maintain momentum in communities to continue participating in the outcomes for long-term success. And lastly, section 6.3 is about preparing for change over time. The adaptation pathways approach only works if we can effectively monitor and track how well strategies are working, and we are able to know when conditions change in such a way that new strategies or approaches may be needed. To build long-term resilience means improving the ability of our systems to be responsive to change. It ends with an ask that everybody involved commit to continuing this work even after a process ends. Adaptation will teach us that our work is never quite over, but it can only continue to be improved upon. I believe success lies in that ability to come together, work together, and continue to take on challenges ahead. The outcomes of Workbook 6 include an adopted implementation plan or other relevant document, and an implementation work plan that includes monitoring approaches and responsibilities. I'll now turn it over to Chris to provide some closing examples and use of this chapter's content back in Marin.
So I'll start with the canal, and the canal in San Rafael is a census designated disadvantaged community. It's a unique community with higher density housing than elsewhere in the county. It has some strong community-based organizations. It has a hub of commercial and industrial businesses, and as well as a big immigrant population. Unfortunately, it's one of the places that has a very high risk to sea level rise. The graphic on the right shows 12 inches of sea level rise, and the area in blue is largely the canal. And those are areas that are currently would be flooded with 12 inches of sea level rise. This is significant not only for the community and the businesses, but it's also a regional transportation area because it's the connection between 580 and 101 in Marin County. So adaptation planning has begun here. Unfortunately, I'm cheating a little bit in this chapter because we haven't yet finished all that work, but it'll continue this year with funding for staff at 2 of the CBOs. The city's general plan update included background and highlighted possible next steps for adaptation in the community. And so the adaptation planning process will actually integrate community input into technical analysis for adaptation design options, and then incorporate that input into a number of different plans. So as of right now, some of the places where that will go will be the neighborhood specific plan, a citywide climate adaptation plan, and then really start to set the stage for next steps in terms of design and implementation of the types of adaptation projects that are defined. The goal is really to embed the input so that we're transparent and accountable, and so that people can stay aware of the process as we move forward. As you all are probably aware, the process takes a really long time and we need to build community input at several key points, but the project itself might be years away. So it's important to document this as we go along in a lot of different places so people can continue to see it and have access to it. And I'll just mention here that funding is really just a key piece to all of this. And so unless you're starting with a really secure funding source, you have money to do what you might design, spending some time thinking about grants, taxes, fees, whatever funding structure you might have as you define your adaptation solutions will be helpful. I'm gonna skip my next slide and go to the last one, Jackie. And so the last slide really talks about 6.3, and that's really preparing for changes over time. And I wanted to just touch on one of the challenges we have faced is monitoring changes over time. Another issue we have is really engaging communities on this complex topic and participating in what can be largely a fairly technical issue. And so we have a couple of monitoring efforts, very low tech in Marin, that I wanted to highlight. One is a community science center, and it's really driven by this photo point in the middle photo. It's in Richardson Bay, and the goal is to make monitoring easy and participatory so that the public engages and better understands the changing conditions and sees for themselves the range of tides that we might plan for in adaptation. So the photo point is actually along the Mill Valley Sausalito bike path and Bay Trail, has information on signage about sea level rise. And then the fence mounted photo point asks people to take 3 pictures by lining up their camera, their phone, whatever device they may have, and then use the hashtag MarinSLR so we can track that over time. The last photo shows a king tide slide produced by students at China Camp, and this is another one of our just annual outreach efforts to try and get monitoring because that funding and that long-term ability to track information can be really difficult to do. We participate in the king tide effort to do that as well. Back to you, Jackie.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much to Chris, Jeremy, and Claire for joining me this morning. And I know to those who are participating, we just shared a lot of information with you. So you have access to the slides. I just want to remind you that this resource is out. It's available for you to use and download now. We've developed a 2-page overview for those who want the short version. And we're also in the process of developing other resource guides to help people understand how to get into this document and where to find what they need. So we recently published this work back in March, and we're eager to see people use it in practice. So please let me know if you'd like a follow-up training or even just a follow-up conversation. Also, please let us know if you'd like to see additional trainings on specific topics or chapters, and if so, feel free to add that to the chat. I've included links to the resources, overview, as well as my email here. So it's been really wonderful sharing all of this with you today, and we look forward to taking any questions or any discussion in the next few minutes.
Woo! Wow, thank you all so much for that overview of that fantastic resource. I particularly really appreciated the real world examples that corresponded with each chapter that helped us envision what this roadmap will really look like when it's being used on the ground. So feel free, everyone on the call, if you want to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, we'll try to get to as many as we can. We have one to start with from Nina Gooddale. And the question is, what's the most effective way for small community-based organizations to advocate for nature-based adaptation for response by our local jurisdictions? And they continue to give a lot of examples in their situation with multiple challenges, including an engineered seawall and contaminants and a FEMA flood zone. So what advice would you give for that situation.
I can take one stab at it, and then maybe we can let Jeremy, if you have any, because this person was asking specifically about nature-based solutions. I mean, I think, I'm looking at the details you included here, so I think it's very clear that you're already very, well informed about the risks facing the community. And I think some key points that Chris mentioned as well that others have raised is this issue of funding. So I think finding ways to continue bringing this issue up, if you can find partnerships with local government, and the value of the adaptation roadmap is to also just make sure that you have these key pieces that you need. You've already included a lot of information here. In chapter 1, we talk about resources, and there's links to grants and other funding sources. So I think you are on your way, and it's very challenging, but I think continuing to raise this and bringing up these very specific points. Jeremy, I'm not sure if you want to add anything specifically about the nature-based challenges.
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities along that shoreline, along Belmont Slough. It's unfortunate there's 2 different cities either side of Belmont Slough, and they're managed sort of, I think, independently, and that we lose sight of the fact there's a slough there with marshes along it, which could be have value in their own right and could be part of that solution. Redwood Shores has potentially flooding from internally and externally from within. There's a flood detention, I think, and pumping requirements from stormwater management as well as from the bay. So one thing I would suggest is to find out what one shoreline, which is the San Mateo Flood and Sea Level Rise Agency, are thinking about in that area. Lots of these places already have plans, and to get involved in those and to raise the opportunities, which are not always seen by some of the larger agencies. They have a lot of responsibilities to manage on the shoreline. So my suggestion would be to find out what those local efforts are going and try and get involved in those.
Wonderful. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll head on to the next question. We had a question directly asking about funding, and considering that so many of these projects are going to cost quite a bit of money and how to access those funds. So are there resources within the roadmap itself that can help lead people to funding, or are there additional resources they can use?
Yeah, so there's various points in the roadmap where we raise the importance of funding. Some of that is in the beginning for those who need to get started. Again, everybody kind of comes into this space with very different starting points. So for those who haven't done some of that visioning, maybe they need funding to do that. In your case, there's also in chapter 5 in this bundling strategies, we raise the importance of identifying specific funding for the types of actions that you're talking about. And so in the art adaptation catalog, that resource that we've linked to here, we've included, we've gathered a lot of different adaptation actions, which include various different funding and financing tools. Funding is one of the categories of the adaptation actions. And so that's a place where you can go to look at different types of mechanisms to be able to fund that, as well as, potentially grants. And often, when you're applying for funding, there's often a lot of questions of like, well, what are you funding for? So this whole process is really designed to help you understand what you want to achieve, and then fund it, and then continuing to fund that through various different, means.
Okay, we have another question about local governments working together. So do you have any examples of local governments working together on solutions that cross jurisdictions? Here in the Humboldt Bay area, there are several cities, counties, special districts, etc. So yeah, what's your answer for that?
I'll start. In Marin County, we actually have 11 cities and towns as well as the county. And so in many places we are trying to work together. The San Rafael Canal example is city, county, and 2 of the CBOs working on adaptation solutions. But I think if you look around, there are probably, Jeremy just mentioned one shoreline in San Mateo County, and I think that's 20 cities and towns with the county as well. So lots of different examples of different ways we're working together. I guess it really comes down to some of those project examples. I don't think we highlighted too many that cross jurisdictions, but they definitely exist. And I think we can follow up with more examples.
All right, questions are pouring in. So how might Caltrans projects take advantage of these resources? thinking in particular about SR37, including the interim and quick fix projects, as well as long-term ultimate projects.
Chris, I'm wondering if you want to potentially answer this, if you've had some experience working with SR37.
And I think Jeremy has as well, but Caltrans is definitely at a different stage in their planning process. I think, you know, if you look through the adaptation roadmap, you'll see that they've done different pieces of it, or different pieces have been done. And maybe that coordination would help and that assessment. But I think there's probably some real specifics here. They're in their CEQA process. So I'm thinking that they're maybe at a stage where this would slow them down rather than help them assess all the pieces. But I can follow up with Kate as well on that one.
And just to follow up on Chris, I think they've spent a long time in their context setting, understanding the landscape, and that's been helped enormously by the environmental groups, by the Balance group, which has been led by the Coastal Conservancy, but involves a lot of the environmental nonprofits in the North Bay, where they've been sharing their experiences and understanding of the landscape and the needs for restoration and incorporating that into the design. So I think both MTC and Caltrans have been very good at listening and asking good questions at that context setting case, and trying to understand scenarios with and without the for the different types of alignments and different types of structures. So I think they're in that kind of phase in this roadmap.
Great, and let's see if we can fit in one more question really quickly. Are there opportunities or interest in relocating old dumps, such as in Sunnyvale, Fremont, et cetera, or is financing too big of an issue?
Well, I jump in. I thought I got interested in landfill mining, which is actually a thing, because I thought that could be self-financing. That because if you apparently if you mine a dump from the 1930s or 1940s, there's lots of valuable metals and all sorts of things in there which could be recycled and reused, and that would help clear the shoreline. Apparently, the more modern landfills we have are much more effective in not throwing away valuable materials, and so it becomes less efficient. But maybe there's a business model there. I don't know.
All right, fantastic. Well, that's about all we have time for today. Thank you to our panelists and for the great presentation and for answering all these great questions. And thank you to all the attendees for taking time today to listen in. I hope everyone learned something new today. I certainly did. Slides in the recording will be available as soon as possible. So have a great rest of your week, everyone, and please take care. Bye.